For decades, Rick Warren has been a symbol of hope, healing, and unwavering faith. Millions know him as the pastor who built Saddleback Church from a small gathering in his home into one of the largest and most influential congregations in the world. His book, The Purpose-Driven Life, changed countless lives, offering comfort to those who felt lost and reminding people that they were created with meaning. But today, news has emerged about Rick Warren that is leaving his followers stunned, worried, and heartbroken. Something unexpected has happened, something even his closest supporters never imagined they would hear at this stage of his journey. As messages of concern spread online, many are asking the same questions. How serious is this? Why wasn't anything shared earlier? And what happens now for the man who spent his entire life guiding others through their darkest moments? Behind the scenes, those who know him well say the situation has taken an emotional toll on Rick Warren and his family, forcing him to confront realities he had kept private for far too long. This news doesn't just affect a pastor, it affects the millions who look to him for strength, leadership, and answers. Whether you followed his sermons, read his books, or simply admired his message of compassion, what has come forward now will make you see his journey in a completely different light. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened, why it matters, and how this moment is reshaping the final chapter of Rick Warren's public life. Rick Warren carried an image of calm strength, someone who always seemed in control, even when life threw its harshest storms his way. But as those close to him now admit, the reality behind the scenes has been far more fragile than anyone realized. The heartbreaking news that recently surfaced didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a long, silent struggle that Rick had been facing privately. Many fans assumed he stepped back from public leadership simply to rest or pursue new spiritual projects, but those explanations only scratched the surface. What he was dealing with internally was far heavier and far more emotional than what he ever allowed himself to show publicly. People who worked with him for decades describe a man who always put others first. He was the one who comforted grieving families, offered guidance during moments of crisis, and devoted endless hours to supporting individuals who felt lost or broken. Yet, while doing all this, Rick was quietly carrying a burden of his own, a burden that had been growing year after year. The pressure of leading one of the world's largest congregations, the weight of global expectations, and the lingering emotional wounds from personal tragedies left marks that never truly healed. Even when he smiled on stage, even when he reassured others with messages of hope, he was fighting a battle he rarely talked about. Those around him say the signs were there, but subtle. He grew more reflective, more tired, more withdrawn, especially in moments when no cameras were present. His family noticed before anyone else, urging him to slow down and take care of himself. But Rick had always been wired to serve, to give, to lead, and to keep going even when it cost him emotionally. The pressure to remain strong, especially for a community that depended on him, made it difficult for him to admit that he needed help. Over time, the strain began to show. Close friends recall moments when Rick would pause mid-conversation, staring off with a heaviness that didn't match his warm public presence. The heartbreaking news that has now come forward confirms what some feared. Rick's health, both emotional and physical, has been far more complicated than he let on. Sources close to the family shared that he had been dealing with a series of silent struggles, trying to manage symptoms he hoped would pass, even as they grew more persistent. His decision to step away from major responsibilities was not simply a transition to a new season of life, it was a necessary step to preserve his well-being. Those who know him describe it as a moment of acceptance, a realization that even the strongest leaders must eventually confront their limits. This revelation has left fans stunned, not because they expected Rick Warren to be invincible, but because he spent decades being the one others leaned on. Hearing that he has reached a point where he must focus on himself has created a wave of emotional reactions, from sadness to empathy to deep respect. Many supporters now see this moment not as a sign of weakness, but as a reminder that every human being, no matter how spiritually grounded, carries a breaking point. Rick Warren's willingness to acknowledge his struggles may ultimately become one of the most meaningful parts of his legacy. As the news continued to spread, people began reflecting on the journey that brought Rick Warren to this moment. For decades, he had been at the center of an enormous spiritual movement, inspiring millions with teachings grounded in purpose, faith, and resilience. But what most people never saw was the toll that constant visibility took on him. Rick's life wasn't simply about preaching once a week. It involved counseling families in crisis, navigating complex church responsibilities, managing public expectations, and carrying the emotional weight of thousands who came to him seeking comfort. This kind of responsibility doesn't just drain a person. Physically, it requires a level of emotional endurance that few can sustain year after year. Friends say there were moments when Rick seemed overwhelmed by the idea that he could never truly clock out. Even late at night, he received messages from people begging for guidance, sharing their struggles, and asking for emotional or spiritual support. He cared deeply about these individuals, but the constant outreach made it difficult for him to find moments of quiet or personal recovery. Gradually, the boundaries between his personal life and public role began to blur, leaving him exhausted in ways he never fully expressed. His days were filled with compassion, but his nights were often filled with emotional unrest. The turning point, according to those close to him, came when he realized he was no longer able to replenish the energy he continued to pour out. His health challenges, once manageable, began to interfere with his work, his sleep, and even his ability to stay focused. There were days when he struggled to keep up with responsibilities he once handled effortlessly. His doctors, noticing the pattern, warned him that if he did not slow down, the consequences could become severe. For a man who spent his life telling others to prioritize their well-being, this was a painful wake-up call. The emotional burden was equally heavy. Rick had lived through personal heartbreaks that left lasting scars, including moments no parent or family should ever have to endure. While he spoke publicly about finding strength through faith, the private battle to process grief and responsibility never fully ended. Over time, unresolved pain began blending with the pressures of leadership, creating a strain that even he could no longer ignore. His loved ones say that it wasn't a single event that pushed him to this point. It was a slow accumulation of emotional weight that eventually became too much to carry silently. When the heartbreaking truth finally became public, many were stunned by how long he had endured these struggles without asking for help. But for those closest to him, the news brought a strange sense of relief because transparency meant healing could finally begin. Rick had always encouraged others to lean on their community, yet he rarely allowed himself the same freedom. This moment forced him to face that contradiction. Instead of pushing through the pain, he made the difficult decision to prioritize rest, reflection, and recovery, even if it meant stepping back from the role that defined most of his life. Now, as fans grapple with this revelation, a new wave of support has emerged. Messages of love and encouragement are pouring in from around the world, reminding Rick that he has touched more lives than he can ever know. His community understands that even the most admired leaders must eventually care for themselves, and many believe this chapter may lead to a healthier, more peaceful future for him. The story is no longer just about heartbreak, it is about humanity, vulnerability, and the courage to acknowledge one's own limits. As Rick Warren stepped back from the intense rhythm that had defined his life for decades, he found himself entering an unfamiliar season, one where the world expected him to slow down, reflect, and heal. For someone who had spent years pouring his heart into others, this shift felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. People close to Rick say the early days of this transition were the hardest. He struggled with the idea of not being present for every crisis, every need, every question from someone seeking comfort. His instinct had always been to lead, to offer guidance, and to be the steady voice in a storm. Letting go, even temporarily, felt like abandoning a purpose he had shaped his life around. But as time passed, a new understanding began to emerge. Rick realized that stepping back did not mean stepping away from the people he cared about. Instead, it gave him space to confront the emotional and physical challenges he had ignored for too long. For the first time in many years, he listened to his body, acknowledging the fatigue that had been building with each passing season. He accepted that healing required not just faith, but also rest, support, and vulnerability, qualities he had often encouraged in others, but rarely allowed himself to embrace. During this period, Rick spent more time with his family, rediscovering the quiet moments he had been missing. Those who visited him say he appeared more present, more grounded, and more emotionally open than he had been in years. His family became a source of strength, reminding him that his worth was not tied to his schedule, his responsibilities, or the pressures of leading a global ministry. Instead, they reminded him that he was allowed to be human, to feel, to struggle, and to heal. Behind the scenes, many of Rick's trusted friends and longtime colleagues stepped in to help carry the weight he once shouldered alone. They handled responsibilities he no longer had the energy to manage, and provided the emotional support he had spent years giving to others. For Rick, this was both humbling and healing. He started to understand that community is not just something a pastor builds, it's something a pastor needs. This realization became one of the most profound lessons of his journey. As Rick continued to reflect on his life, he began to see how much he had sacrificed for the sake of service. The endless hours of preparation, counseling, decision-making, and travel had left little room for personal peace. Now, for the first time, he could breathe without the pressure of being responsible for thousands of people. This shift allowed him to process long-buried emotions, confront unresolved grief, and acknowledge the deep exhaustion that had lingered beneath the surface for years. Fans watching from the outside might have imagined that Rick's retreat into a quieter life would be a sign of defeat, but those closest to him say it has been the opposite. The time away has allowed him to regain clarity, rediscover his sense of balance, and appreciate the simple moments that once slipped past him unnoticed. He has learned that healing doesn't always come from pushing harder. Sometimes it comes from stepping back, letting others help, and allowing space for renewal. Even though the news surrounding Rick Warren's condition has left many heartbroken, his response to this difficult chapter has inspired a different kind of admiration. His willingness to be vulnerable, to prioritize his health, and to embrace a slower, more reflective life is becoming an unexpected source of comfort for those who follow his journey. It serves as a reminder that even the strongest leaders need rest, and that choosing healing is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of courage. As Rick Warren enters this new chapter of his life, the people closest to him believe it may become one of the most defining seasons of his entire journey, not because of what he is doing, but because of what he is allowing himself to feel. For years, he carried the weight of responsibility, leadership, and public expectation like armor, shielding others from pain while quietly enduring his own. Now, without the constant pressure of leading one of the world's largest congregations, he has finally been given something he never truly had before: space to simply exist as Rick. Not Pastor Rick, not the author of a best-selling book, not the face of a global church movement, just a human being navigating life's challenges. This shift has opened the door for deeper reflection. Rick has begun looking back on his journey not with regret, but with a clearer understanding of what it cost him emotionally and physically. He recognizes that he gave everything he had to the mission he believed in, but he also sees how much of himself was quietly lost along the way. The long nights, the endless meetings, the unrelenting expectations from millions of people seeking guidance, that all slowly drained him. And now, with the truth about his condition finally public, he no longer feels the need to hide behind strength or pretend that everything is fine. The honesty has been freeing. Support from around the world continues to pour in, reminding Rick that he does not have to face this journey alone. Messages from fans, readers, and former members of his congregation share stories of how his teachings helped them through their darkest seasons. These words have become a source of comfort, reassuring him that his impact will never fade. Even if he is no longer standing in front of a crowd every week, his legacy is not tied to stage lights or sermons. It lives in the millions of lives he touched with compassion, humility, and faith. Those closest to Rick say that while this news is undeniably heartbreaking, it has encouraged him to view life through a different lens. Instead of constantly planning for the next message, the next project, or the next responsibility, he is learning to embrace peace, rest, and the quiet moments he once had no time for. He spends more time with family, reconnects with old friends, and allows himself to enjoy the small blessings that were once overshadowed by the demands of leadership. Even simple activities, quiet mornings, slow walks, Moments of reflection have now become meaningful parts of his healing. Many fans have wondered if Rick will ever return to the public eye in the way he once did. Those close to him say that the future remains uncertain, and for the first time, Rick is comfortable with that uncertainty. He is no longer driven by deadlines or pressure. Instead, he is focused on rebuilding his strength, nurturing his emotional health, and walking through life one day at a time. If he returns, it will be because he truly feels ready, not because he feels obligated. And if he chooses to remain in this quieter season, his supporters will understand, because they now see the immense burden he carried for so long. In the end, Rick Warren's story has taken a turn few expected, but it has also revealed a powerful truth. Even the strongest leaders need space to heal. His willingness to step back, to be vulnerable, and to put his well-being first has become a profound example of courage. Though the news surrounding him may be heartbreaking, it has opened the door to a chapter filled with honesty, healing, and unexpected peace.